Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Presidential Conference Center at Texas A&M University. I am Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service, which is sponsoring this evening's lecture. This is the third in a series of lectures on the influence of the world's great religious traditions on international affairs. On March 4th, we will have former Ambassador to the Holy See Francis Rooney speak. In the fall, Rabbi David Saperstein, who serves as the U.S. Ambassador for Religious Freedom, will speak about his work on behalf of those oppressed around the world because of their faith. Rabbi Saperstein's coming visit is particularly timely as the new president of Texas A&M, Michael Young, who will take office, I think, in June, is the former chairman of the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom in the State Department. Our guest speaker this evening, George Weigel, is one of the best-known public intellectuals in the United States, particularly with respect to the role of the Roman Catholic Church in world affairs. From 1989 to 1996, Mr. Weigel served as the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which is where I first met him while I served as a vice president of World Vision, the faith-based non-governmental organization. George is the author or editor of more than 20 books. I think a couple of those I wrote chapters at your request in. His essays and op-ed columns and reviews regularly appear in journals, magazines, and newspapers across the United States. Appears often on television. He's the analyst, the Vatican analyst for NBC News. His weekly column, The Catholic Difference, is syndicated in more than 60 newspapers. He is a graduate of St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore and his master's degree from the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto. He has been awarded 18 honorary doctorates. Stalin was once told that Pope Pius XII thought he should stop repressing Catholics under his yoke, to which Stalin famously replied, "The Pope, how many divisions has he got?" John Paul II answered Stalin's rhetorical question decades later as he accelerated the forces which brought down the Soviet Empire. George Weigel's book, Witness to Hope, the biography of John Paul II, has been translated into 14 languages, sold more than 1 million copies, and is perhaps the most comprehensive, in-depth study of the life and work of the Pope. George Weigel was not only John Paul II's biographer, but also his advisor and counselor. The role of this remarkable man in shaping the history of the last decades of the 20th century is the subject of George Weigel's lecture this evening. We are honored to have you join us returning to Texas A&M. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Natsios, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. When the Catholic Church celebrated the canonizations of Popes John the 23rd and John Paul II this past April, the Church was not making saints, and neither was Pope Francis. Rather, the Church and the Pope were recognizing two saints that God had made, publicly declaring its conviction that these were two men in whom the grace conferred in baptism had borne fruit in a heroic exercise of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, and the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, courage, and moderation. The canonization of popes, a rarity for almost half a millennium, but now something of a commonplace, raises special problems of comprehension today. For in a celebrity-crazed culture like our own, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that by canonizing a pope, the Church is conferring a posthumous seal of approval on every decision that pope made. That's not the case. In canonizing Pope Pius X, the Church was not suggesting that the persecution of certain Catholic intellectuals during his pontificate, conducted under the guise of a challenge to the very real dangers of theological modernism, was just. Nor in canonizing John the 23rd was the Church giving a posthumous benediction to that Pope's 1962 Apostolic Constitution, mandating the teaching of all seminary theology courses in Latin. Nor in canonizing John Paul II was the Church proclaiming that every bishop appointed during his 26-and-a-half-year pontificate, had been the right man for the job in question. Rather, the challenging issue here involves papal governance and the virtue of prudence, which Thomas Aquinas described as right reason in action. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, for its part, defines prudence as the virtue that disposes a person to discover the good and the correct means to accomplish it. The Catechism also cautions against confusing prudence with either timidity or fear. Thus, prudence, understood in this sense, is the chief of the cardinal virtues applicable to the tasks of governance, whether the governance in question is a matter of churchcraft, statecraft, or their interaction. Now, it's not all that difficult, at least in recent centuries, to imagine a pope living faith, hope, charity, justice, moderation, and courage in an exemplary way. But what does it mean for a pope in governing the church as a successor of Peter to exercise the virtue of prudence heroically? Reflecting on this as I was preparing The End and the Beginning, the second volume of my biography of John Paul II, it seemed obvious to me that the heroic exercise of the virtue of prudence in the exercise of papal governance could not mean getting everything right. No pope, going back to Peter himself, gets everything right. As St. Paul noted with some asperity in his letter to the Galatians, writing that, quote, "When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned." That's getting in your face. So then, what does it mean for a pope to exercise the virtue of prudence in a heroic and exemplary way? My conclusion was that the heroic exercise of prudence by a pope involves the steady determination to make decisions about situations and personalities without fear and without seeking favor, always trying to bring one's best judgment about circumstances and people to bear, even if that involves difficulties and costs. This specifically papal exercise of the virtue of prudence would also seem to involve an exemplary capacity to read what the Second Vatican Council called the signs of the times, and to do so in ways that open opportunities for evangelically inspired action, to preaching the gospel and to teaching the truths about the human condition contained within the gospel so that history's trajectory is bent in a more humane direction. When a pope dies, a legal document called the Rogito is drawn up, summarizing the pope's life and accomplishments. The Rogito is then signed by senior churchmen and sealed in a metal tube, which is buried with the pope so that future generations might identify him and know something about him. The Rogito of the life and pontificate of John Paul II concluded with a sentence that aptly summarized the reasons why, some 8 years later, the Catholic Church would recognize in his life a saint that God had made, whose example could inspire others to live with a similar nobility. And that sentence was, John Paul II has left to all an admirable testimony of piety, of a holy life, and of universal fatherhood. In canonizing John Paul II, then, the Catholic Church was not recommending the Polish Pope as a model of statesmanship, as, for example, later generations of scholars and political leaders might lift up George C. Marshall or Dean Acheson as models of statesmanship. Still, John Paul II's heroic exercise of the chief virtue of statecraft, prudence, contains important lessons for those practicing the arts of governance on a global stage in the 21st century. John Paul II always insisted correctly that he was neither diplomat nor politician. He was rather a pastor who, in exercising his pastoral responsibilities, had some things to say to the world of political power, because the things he said had to do with the Church's defense of human dignity, the protection of which gives the exercise of public authority its distinctive excellence, and a fundamental moral purpose. Yet this Polish-born pastor who refused to don the mantle of politician or diplomat, choosing instead the role of moral witness, was the most politically consequential pope in centuries. A pope whose evangelically inspired action changed history and left a deep impression on the future, so that the footprints of his distinctive statecraft can be found all over the world. In Central and Eastern Europe, which he helped liberate from communism, in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, where men formed by John Paul II's social doctrine are striving to make freedom for excellence work in the political and economic fields, in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, where John Paul II's robust defense of religious freedom as the first of human rights has taken on new and perhaps unexpected salience in postmodern societies threatened by what Benedict XVI called the dictatorship of relativism. Now, to be sure, the responsibilities of a pope and the responsibilities of presidents, prime ministers, members of legislatures, diplomats, and other public officials are not identical. Popes no longer deploy hard power in the form of armies as they once did. Democratic leaders charged with the defense of the common good must calculate the interests of the people they represent and serve in ways that popes don't, which is to say that popes and public officials deal with international politics out of different toolkits. Still, in this season, in which statecraft is often misunderstood as a form of psychotherapy, things seem to be becoming unhinged, and the West is unsure of itself and its role as the guarantor of a measure of decency and order in world affairs. What might statesmen who seek to defend freedom and advance the cause of human rights and democracy learn from the distinctive global statecraft of a saint who had a real impact on what the punditocracy is pleased to call the real world? 7 such lessons suggest themselves. The first lesson: culture comes first. John Paul II's statecraft rejected the fallacies that had made political modernity a slaughterhouse. He rejected the Jacobin fallacy, born in 1789, that history is driven by politics, understood as the quest for power, understood as my ability to impose my will on you. He rejected the Marxist fallacy that history is merely the exhaust fumes of the means of production. And he rejected the liberal fallacy that if a society only gets the machinery of democracy and the free economy right, those machines can run by themselves. Rather, drawing on both Catholic and Polish sources, John Paul II insisted that culture was, is, and always will be the most dynamic force in history, both defensively in terms of resisting tyranny and positively in terms of building and sustaining free societies. Moreover, he understood that at the center of culture is cult, or religion, what people believe, cherish, and worship, what people are willing to stake their lives and their children's lives on. This culture-first approach to history and statecraft was on full display during John Paul's epic first papal pilgrimage to Poland, 9 days in June 1979, on which the history of the 20th century pivoted. Those 9 days are often described as a moment of national catharsis, and there is undoubtedly something to that. The pent-up frustrations, sorrows, and angers engendered by Poland's awful experiences over 2 centuries, its vivisection in the late 19th century, its demolition by Nazis, and its desecration by communists, began to be healed by the triumphant return to his homeland of Poland's papal son. But a lot more went on during those 9 days than catharsis. What went on then is more properly described as transformation, the revitalization of culture in a revolution of conscience, ignited by John Paul II's summons to the people he knew so well, in which he said, in a virtual infinity of variations on the same great theme, "You are not who they say you are. Reclaim who you really are. Own the truth of your history and your culture, and you will find tools of resistance that totalitarianism cannot match." The 9 days of John Paul II in June 1979 were arguably the most politically potent papal intervention in world politics since the High Middle Ages. Yet during those 9 days, the Pope didn't mention politics or economics once. Rather, the Pope spoke the truth of Poland's history, its culture, and its national self-understanding in, as I say, dozens of variations on one great theme. And by returning to his people the truth about themselves, he helped them forge tools of liberation that were essentially moral and cultural in nature. Deployed over a hard decade of struggle that led to the triumphs of the Revolution of 1989, those tools proved more than adequate in answering that cynical question that Dr. Natsios reminded us was raised by Stalin, I believe at Yalta. The Pope, how many divisions does he have? The second lesson, ideas count for good and for ill. I doubt that John Paul II ever read John Maynard Keynes, but he certainly understood the truth of what the Cambridge Economist meant when Keynes wrote, quote, "Both when they are right and when they are wrong, ideas are more powerful than is commonly understood. In fact, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. Soon or late, it is ideas that are dangerous for good or evil." The dangers of false ideas John Paul knew from experience, living in what Timothy Snyder has aptly dubbed the bloodlands of East Central Europe. He had seen the lethal effects of Lenin's, Stalin's, and Hitler's wicked ideas in the deaths of tens of millions of human beings, including his friends and classmates. But he also knew from experience the regenerative power of noble ideas. For example, the ideas of Christian democracy deployed by men like Konrad Adenauer, Alcide de Gasperi, and Robert Schuman in rebuilding post-war Europe and laying the foundations of today's European Union. In both cases, the wicked, false, and death-dealing ideas and the good, true, and ennobling ideas, what was most crucial in John Paul II's view was the idea of the human person being proposed. Or to use a social science term in its philosophical sense, what counted was anthropology. And here we find the connection between Karol Wojtyła, a Polish philosopher, and John Paul II, statesman. In the first decades of his pontificate, John Paul II, statesman, saw that the Yalta division of Europe was not only wrong, but fragile and unsustainable, because Karol Wojtyła, Polish philosopher, knew that Stalin's power grab in the waning days of the Second World War was in service to a false idea of the human person, a warped ideology, a warped anthropology that led inevitably to the Gulag, the KGB, and all the rest of the apparatus of Soviet repression. In the last years of his papacy, John Paul II, statesman, knew that 21st century Europe risked dissolving into incoherence because Karol Wojtyła, Polish philosopher, had accurately measured the deficiencies of the atheistic humanism and soul-withering secularism that were at the root of Europe's post-Cold War crisis of civilizational morale. Thus, the democratic statesman who wishes to learn from the example of John Paul II will take ideas and the war of ideas with as much seriousness as he or she takes indices of gross national product or measures of military capability. Why? Because all three are connected. Neither wealth nor military power will be usefully deployed in the cause of freedom in the 21st century if the will to do so is not present. And it seems unlikely that such a will, the will to challenge the lies and propaganda of the forces of disorder as an essential component of restoring a measure of order to world affairs, will be formed if the political culture of the West continues to be eroded from within by skepticism, relativism, and irony, and by an anthropology that reduces the human person to a mere bundle of desires, and by a nihilism that mocks all religious and moral conviction. The third lesson, don't psychologize the adversary. One result of the decline of philosophy and the concurrent rise of social science in the late modern and postmodern Western academy has been the emergence of psychological approaches to statecraft, as political theory has sadly disappeared from many university curricula, and political science has become a subset of statistics. In American terms, one can trace this back to the social science theories popular among the best and brightest of the Kennedy-Johnson years. The mandarins who believed that a naval blockade of Cuba in 1962 was a form of communication, and who imagined that signaling North Vietnam by turning the spigot of air power on and off could change Ho Chi Minh's behavior. The Obama-era analog to this psychologization of statecraft is the famous reset. First with Russia and the Arab Islamic world, most recently with Cuba, perhaps this year or next with Iran. The premise here is that bad guys behave badly because of what we do, so that if we behave differently, their behavior will change and become less disagreeable, perhaps even downright praiseworthy. John Paul II knew this for the foolishness it was and is. As a keen student of the human condition, he understood that bad guys behave badly because of who they are, what they espouse, and what they seek, not because of anything we did to them. Thus, he could focus on the issues at hand, religious freedom and other basic human rights in the communist world, for example, without tying himself up in knots over whether the Cold War division of Europe was somehow Harry Truman's fault. Unlike Western revisionist historians, John Paul understood that Stalin, his heirs, and their Polish epigones did what they did because of who they were, what they believed, and what they sought, not because good old Uncle Joe had been offended by the haberdasher from Independence, Missouri at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. The 21st century lessons to be drawn from this papal clarity about the sources of conflict should be obvious. To take one urgent case, Vladimir Putin is doing what he's doing in Ukraine, Moldova, the Baltic states, and elsewhere, not because of anything Ukraine, Moldova, or other post-Soviet states did to him or to Russia, but because of who he is, what he believes, and what he seeks. Thus, narratives of the current war in Ukraine that seek to balance responsibilities for the conflict or describe it as a civil war distort reality, and in doing so make creative and sensible policy virtually impossible. The same is true of the Shia totalitarians who hold ultimate authority in Tehran. Unless their behavior in seeking a nuclear capability is understood on its own terms, as an expression of their own apocalyptic ideas and ambitions, rather than as a reaction to pressures from the Sunni world, the West, or both, the world will remain vulnerable to Iranian dissembling and stalling, and the likelihood of an Iranian bomb will grow accordingly. The fourth lesson: speak loudly and be supple in deploying whatever sticks, large or small, you have at hand. When John Paul II was elected the 264th Bishop of Rome on October 16, 1978, Vatican diplomacy was well into the second decade of what was called its Ostpolitik, an approach to the problem of local Catholic churches behind the Iron Curtain that avoided public condemnation of communism's human rights violations for the sake of reaching diplomatic agreements with Warsaw Pact countries. Those agreements were supposed to guarantee the Church's freedom to live its sacramental life behind the Iron Curtain by its own standards. But in the event, what limited agreements were achieved demoralized the resistance church in several East Bloc countries, turned the Catholic Church in Hungary into a subsidiary of the Hungarian party state, did nothing to relieve the condition of Catholics in the Soviet Union, and opened the Vatican to further penetration by communist intelligence services, a process that had begun in the early 1960s. Yet on becoming Pope, John Paul was shrewd enough not to dismantle the Ostpolitik of Pope Paul VI, his predecessor, and Paul VI's principal diplomat, Archbishop Agostino Casaroli. Rather, he made Casaroli his own Secretary of State, named him a cardinal, and gave him full rein to pursue his diplomacy east of the Elbe River. Thus, no communist leader could publicly accuse the Church of reneging on its previous commitments because of a reactionary Polish pope in league with NATO, although Soviet and East Bloc propaganda and disinformation campaigns worked overtime to sell precisely that message throughout the West, not without some success. But while Casaroli continued his bilateral diplomatic efforts, John Paul II restored the Catholic Church's voice in challenging human rights violations and calling upon communist states to honor their human rights commitments under Basket 3 of the 1976 Helsinki Final Act, and he did so by making his voice the Vatican's principal voice. Time and again, in venue after venue, John Paul II lifted up the first freedom, religious freedom, and brought his case before the world in his 1979 address to the UN General Assembly. And because of that papal megaphone and its amplification by Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, the resistance church behind the Iron Curtain knew it had a champion. Those in the West committed to supporting the resistance church in Central and Eastern Europe were inspired to expand their efforts, and all the while the Soviet rationale for the Cold War was being systematically undercut in the order of ideas. The Polish Pope applied the same methods in his effort to shore up those Catholic leaders working for justice and peace in Central America in the face of Marxist governments and insurgencies there. The Sandinista tide began to recede when John Paul II vocally confronted the adolescent cheerleading of Daniel Ortega and his comrades at a 1983 papal mass in Managua, and the entire affair, including the Pope demanding silence from Ortega and company so that he could preach his sermon, was telecast throughout the region. Yet John Paul was also willing to be the quiet persuader, working behind the scenes while local churchmen did the denouncing of injustice when that seemed appropriate, a method that worked well in Argentina, Chile, and the Philippines, as the Pope met with, and thus gave his tacit blessing to, local human rights activists and political reformers, while he worked privately on the Argentine military, on General Augusto Pinochet, and on President Ferdinand Marcos, urging them to respect human rights and restore democracy in their countries. Thus, the lesson for 21st century statecraft: moral pressure can be an important lever in world politics, but effective human rights advocacy and democracy promotion require dexterity. diplomatic dexterity, and dexterity in waging the battle of ideas. The fifth lesson, listen to the martyrs. The Ostpolitik that set the default positions in Vatican diplomacy for some 15 years prior to the election of John Paul II did not dishonor the persecuted local churches behind the Iron Curtain, but it did tend to regard their intransigence as an obstacle to diplomatic accommodation between the Vatican and communist regimes. And such accommodations had to be reached, according to the Ostpolitik, because the Yalta division of Europe was a permanent reality of world politics, not a temporary aberration. Thus, in the decade prior to John Paul's election, Pope Paul VI removed Cardinals Joseph Beran and Joseph Mindszenty from their posts in Prague and Budapest, and kept the exiled leader of the Greek Catholic Church in Soviet-occupied Ukraine, Cardinal Joseph Slipyj, at a distance. John Paul II, for his part, had long read the witness of the martyr confessors in the underground churches behind the Iron Curtain differently. To his mind, the witness of these brave men and women, living and dead, helped strengthen a religiously informed cultural resistance to communism because it embodied in a unique way the moral pressure that could and should be exerted on communist regimes. So during his time as Archbishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła clandestinely ordained priests for service in the underground church in Czechoslovakia in what amounted to a tacit challenge to the Vatican's Ostpolitik. As Pope, he made sure that the world, and especially the Kremlin, knew of his meeting with the Ukrainian Cardinal Slipyj, leader of the largest underground church in the world, a month after his election. That meeting took place a few weeks after he had sent his Cardinal Zucchetto to the Ostra-Brahma shrine at Vilnius in Lithuania as a gesture of solidarity with another long-suffering and bitterly persecuted local church, a gesture that was repaid within weeks as the Lithuanian Committee for the Defense of Believers' Rights was formed and became one of the most dogged human rights proponents in the Soviet Union. This pattern continued throughout the pontificate and was not limited to the Pope's support for fellow Catholics. John Paul II deployed his own private contacts into the USSR to keep himself informed of the views of the hard-pressed human rights resistance there. One result of that clandestine papal intelligence operation was his December 1985 meeting in the Vatican with Helena Bonner, wife of Andrei Sakharov, which was arranged by one of John Paul's informal agents, Irina Ilivskaya Alberti, former aide to Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his Vermont exile. For John Paul II, the witness of the modern martyr confessors deserved honor and respect in its own right. Just as the Church demeaned itself, he believed, when it accommodated the demands of totalitarian persecutors, so the Church was strengthened by acknowledging the witness of its sons and daughters who had taken the risk of freedom and paid the price for it. Honoring the persecuted Church also had an important effect on the Holy See's diplomatic action in world politics, John Paul seemed to think. It acted as a brake upon that realpolitik pragmatism that is common to European foreign ministries, but that is neither realistic nor pragmatic over the long haul. There are lessons here for both statesmen and churchmen in dealing with such 21st century challenges as the transition to a post-communist future in Cuba and China, and in responding to the lethal threats posed by jihadist Islam to Christian communities in the Middle East and Africa. Listening to the voices of the martyr confessors of these regions will clarify the obstacles to a better future posed by the Cuban and Chinese regimes and by jihadists. Lifting up the witness of living martyr confessors publicly and persistently might also afford them a measure of protection while helping sustain islands of civil society essential to future progress towards justice and peace in Cuba, China, the Middle East, and Africa. The sixth lesson: think long-term and do not sacrifice core principles to what seems immediate advantage. In the mid-1980s, after martial law had been lifted in Poland, but while the Solidarity trade union was still legally banned, officials of General Wojciech Jaruzelski's communist regime sounded out Polish church leaders with a proposal. The regime would open a national dialogue on Poland's future, and the church would act as the regime's interlocutor. Some Polish churchmen were tempted by that offer, but John Paul II refused to take the bait. Solidarity was the proper representative of Polish civil society in his view, and the church should not substitute itself in that role, especially when that meant tacitly acquiescing to Solidarity's legal non-status. The church could help facilitate a conversation between the regime and the opposition, but the church ought not replace the opposition. That decision had theological roots in John Paul II's theology of the church, his ecclesiology. The church could not be a partisan political actor because that contradicted the Eucharistic character of the church, a theme he had stressed in his challenge to various forms of liberation theology in Latin America. But it was also based on John Paul II's social doctrine. In that vision of the free and virtuous society, the church formed the people who formed the civil society and the political institutions that did the work of politics. The church was not a political agent in its own right, although the church obviously had a voice in society. In the event, the church's refusal to play opposition party to the leading role of the Communist Party in Poland increased the pressure on the Jaruzelski regime to recognize the real Polish opposition, which was represented by Solidarity. Thus, John Paul II's principal decision helped create the conditions for the possibility of the Polish Roundtable of early 1989 and the partially free elections of June 1989. And those elections, by delivering an overwhelming victory to Solidarity, made possible the first non-communist government in post-war Polish history the following September. The lesson here for both 21st century statesmen and the diplomats of the Vatican would seem to be this: the cause of freedom and the cause of the church are both best served when statesmen and churchmen acting as statesmen think long-term and do not bracket or minimize core principles for what can seem to be immediate advantage. That lesson bears on the church's role in Cuba today, where local church leaders' understandable concerns to strengthen the church's institutional infrastructure should go hand in hand with a vigorous defense of those dissidents who form the core of the Cuban civil society of the future. This sixth John Paul II lesson should also raise cautions about the current push for full diplomatic relations between the Vatican and the People's Republic of China. In the present circumstances, any such deal would require the Vatican to sever its diplomatic exchange with the Republic of China on Taiwan, the first Chinese democracy in history. What signal would such a deal with such a price tag send about the Catholic Church's vision of China's future? What signal would it send about the Church's concern for the hard-pressed and often persecuted elements of civil society that exist in China today and are pressing for a non-authoritarian and open future? The evangelical mission of the Church in the Cuba and the mainland China of the future are not going to be materially advanced by accommodating too easily to the regnant regimes in those countries, and neither is the path beyond Castroite communism and Chinese authoritarianism. There are also lessons here for the Holy See's role in Ukraine. The long-standing Vatican priority given to cordial ecumenical relations and serious theological dialogue with the Russian Orthodox Church ought to be re-examined in light of the unhappy fact that in the drama of Ukraine these past 15 months, the current Russian Orthodox leadership has functioned as an agent of Russian state power, playing its own sorry role in Kremlin propaganda and disinformation campaigns. Neither common ecumenical witness in defense of international legal norms nor serious theological dialogue is possible under those circumstances. Pretending otherwise merely reinforces the damage being done by aggressors. The seventh lesson. Media reality isn't necessarily reality, and the statesman cannot play acolyte to such narratives. The most unintentionally hilarious commentary on the public impact of Pope John Paul II came from the editorial page of the New York Times, perhaps not surprisingly. John Paul was in the middle of those epic 9 days of June 1979 when, on June 5th, the Times ran an editorial on the papal pilgrimage with this conclusion, quote, "As much as the visit of Pope John Paul II to Poland must reinvigorate the Catholic Church in Poland, it does not threaten the political order of the nation or of Eastern Europe." Oops. Why did the Times miss so badly what was afoot in Poland? In part, I suspect, because it regarded the Roman Catholic Church in Poland as of no more political consequence to the political order of the nation or of Eastern Europe than the Polish Flat Earth Society, which, come to think of it, is not a bad analog for the Times' general view of the Catholic Church. Then there was the view in the liberal world, for which the Times was both mirror and infallible teaching authority, that the Cold War would be resolved when an increasingly social democratic West converged with a liberalizing East, and the Berlin Wall would simply dissolve. A narrative that was also popular in certain European and indeed in certain Vatican circles. And then there was the Times' concern, shared by many foreign policy realists in the United States and Western Europe, that any disturbance of the post-war Yalta order threatened nuclear holocaust. So while it might be too bad for what were once called the captive nations, the way things were was the way things were going to have to be, lest greater demons be set loose. These narratives, the narrative of the political irrelevance of religion in the late 20th century, the narrative of convergence, and the change risks nuclear war narrative, seemed to be reality. But they weren't reality. They were merely simulacra of reality. John Paul II was wise enough to know that and act according to what was really reality. The reality that a morally informed human rights resistance, based on a clear and correct conception of the dignity of the human person, attacked communism at its most vulnerable point, and thus held one of the keys to settling the Cold War in favor of the forces of freedom. This problem of confusing reality with media reality or narrative has intensified since 1979, in no small part because of the ubiquity of social media and instant internet commentary, both of which readily create narratives that seem to be reality. Yet the statesmen of the 21st century would do well to take a lesson from John Paul II and read the signs of the times more closely than is possible through lenses crafted by narrative. The same lesson applies to churchmen. Church leaders, clerical and lay, who respond to media-generated narratives about the Catholic Church rather than to the imperatives of the gospel are not going to advance either the evangelical mission of the Church or the cause of human dignity and freedom. The gospel has power, and its power can cut through the densest of false narratives. Finally, what might be the lessons of the singular public effect of St. John Paul II for all of us? While there are many admirable qualities in the life of John Paul II that we would all do well to emulate, what is perhaps most compelling and inspiring at this historical moment is his refusal to submit to what I have come to call the tyranny of the possible. The great hopes that followed the revolution of 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the various color revolutions in the post-communist world, and most recently the Arab Spring, have often been frustrated. History is manifestly not over, and the forces that stand for ordered liberty in the world seem to be in retreat. Too much of Latin America has reverted to chronic patterns of corruption and authoritarianism, or corruption and incompetence, or corruption, incompetence, and authoritarianism. Europe, incapable of putting its fiscal house in order, responding forcefully to the threats posed by a revanchist Russia, or dealing with home-brewed jihadist terrorism and anti-Semitism, remains paralyzed by a crisis of civilizational morale that only the willfully ignorant or fanatically secular will fail to recognize as spiritual in character. That religious freedom has come under assault in the West within 2 decades of its vindication in the formerly communist world, excuse me, was not something that many expected in 1989 or at the turn of the millennium for that matter. What Pope Francis has aptly described as a throwaway culture in which the disposable are not just consumer goods but people is eroding the moral cultural fabric of our civilization. Drastically different ideas of the human person, human community, and human destiny are in conflict throughout the Western world and have much to do with the alleged gridlock of American domestic politics. At a moment like this, it is imperative that we take a lesson from John Paul II and not bind ourselves with the self-imposed shackles of low expectations, submitting to the tyranny of the possible as the conventional wisdom of the day defines the possible. Had Karol Wojtyła, on becoming Pope John Paul II, accepted the conventional wisdom of that moment, he would have settled down to manage the inevitable decline of the Catholic Church in a world permanently divided along geopolitical and ideological fault lines defined in the late 1940s. Because he believed more deeply and thus saw more clearly, he discerned sources of renewal in the church where others saw only decay, and he saw openings for freedom where others only saw impenetrable walls. By refusing to bend to the tyranny of the possible, he helped make what seemed impossible not only possible, but real. Events proved that his signature challenge on October 22nd, 1978, "Be not afraid," was not romanticism. It was the deepest, truest realism. Or as he put it to thousands of young people in Krakow in June 1979, as they gathered near the site of the martyrdom of St. Stanislaus, "Be afraid only of thoughtlessness and pusillanimity." The West would do well to heed that summons and that challenge today. Thank you. Sure.
So, we have microphones here. I'll start off with just a couple of questions, and then we'll take your questions. So if you line up I hope there's some questions, or I'll just have to make up questions myself. Let me ask you first, based on your initial talk about the centrality of culture. When Samuel Huntington came out with his book, The Clash of Civilizations, it was widely attacked by both realists and liberal internationalists as a bizarre misreading of history. And you seem to suggest that perhaps maybe Huntington was right. What do you think?
Even more bizarrely, it was attacked by senior churchmen in the Vatican.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, who seemed to think that Sam's book was deeply misunderstood as a kind of prescription for global culture war. It's not what it was. It was a description of what the dynamics shaping a 21st century world would be like. It was particularly idiotic, if I may say, for churchmen to object to this, because that book was the first book by a world-class political theorist in maybe 100 years to take religion seriously as a dynamic force in human affairs, including world politics. Now, you can argue about how Dr. Huntington divided up the global pie, where the borders are, and so forth and so on, but it seems to me he's been utterly vindicated by events. And the wooden-headedness, if I may say, of our own government under several administrations now to come to grips with this is deeply disturbing. I mean, there seems to be an ingrained resistance to this way of thinking in the permanent bureaucracy, in the foreign service, which is a very, very secularized slice of Americana, lots of very bright people, but not people who look like, in that sense, the rest of the country. And this is deeply problematic for reading the present and for imagining the future.
Are there questions? Yes, sir.
So with the dictatorship of relativism and the, I guess the media not really getting things right and thus misleading the rest of us, how is it that you have such a clear perspective that seems, I think, to make more sense than what the media likes to say? And how do we get that perspective, and how do we help our statesmen to have that perspective?
Well, are you a student here?
No, I work for College Station ISD.
For College Station?
Independent School District.
I see, very good. Well, you're in the right business. Because the short answer is ideas have consequences. And one of the advantages of clear ideas is that they help you see things more clearly. I think someone seeking a career in public service, either domestically or in the international sphere, who does not have a firm grounding in political theory, in a firm grounding in why we make the claims for human rights that we do, why it is wicked to oppress other people, what the moral case for the superiority of democracy over other forms of governance is going to be at a real disadvantage in a world that is not working out the way my friend Frank Fukuyama thought it was going to work out. I mean, Frank's position now is, well, it's just going to take a while longer, but you know, this is, the course is still set. And maybe that's true, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a Hegelian, so I don't have his confidence in this. I think we have learned over the past 6 years, perhaps over the last 8 years, how fragile order is in the world, and that if somebody isn't keeping order, order is not going to happen by itself. And we should have learned that the only way to beat what seemed to us to be bad ideas, perhaps even wicked ideas, is with good and noble ideas. Let me take a perhaps controversial example. I wrote a column that some of you may have seen, both in my Catholic Press column and in NRO. I had 2 different pieces on the Charlie Hebdo business, in which I said I was not comforted in terms of the future by 1 million people walking through the streets of Paris, holding up signs saying, "I am Charlie Hebdo," or "We are Charlie Hebdo." Why? I actually know Charlie Hebdo. Unlike most Americans, I began to see this magazine 17 years ago when I was working on Witness to Hope and was in Paris for the World Youth Day with John Paul II in 1997. This is not a sophisticated form of Mad magazine. It's a very vulgar, almost pornographic, nihilistic dumping on everything, with a veneer of French intellectual sophistication on top of the vulgarity. That is obviously not any excuse for homicide, but to say, "I am Charlie Hebdo," and that's how I can resist these forces of wickedness that murdered those people, is to suggest, whether you recognize that you're doing this or not, that nihilism, nothing counts, is the antidote to fanaticism. That just doesn't work. The fanatics are going to win every time. And that's the condition that Europe is in today. As manifest by the fact that Europe can give no account for the free speech it says it was celebrating in the response to the Charlie Hebdo massacre. I mean, within 10 days of those killings, there were 6 arrests in France of people for violating so-called hate speech laws. I mean, the incoherence here is very, very problematic. So, I think unless the West and those who are teaching its next generation can help the leaders of the future understand why we live the way we do, why we think tolerance is superior to intolerance, why we think tolerance means engaging differences civilly, not ignoring differences as if differences make no difference. If you can help the future leaders of Texas, the United States, the Western world understand that, you'll be doing a very good thing with your life. Say what?
That's a big order.
Well, think big. I mean, you know.
You told a story earlier today from your book. I asked you about that particular moment when Poland was surrounded by the Soviet bloc armies and that the Pope acted, and you told the story about the letter. Why don't you go through that narrative? Because I think it's interesting as to how the Pope used his moral authority to influence the course of events.
Well, this is December 1980. The first Solidarity Congress has been held in Gdansk in August, September 1980. After a lot of fuss and bother, Solidarity had been legally registered in communist Poland. But things were very, very unstable. And by late November of 1980, there were 23 Warsaw Pact divisions, Russian, Czech, and East German, deployed on the periphery of Poland. And it looked as if it was going to be Prague 1968, or Budapest 1956, or Berlin 1953, all over again. The United States government, in the last days of the Carter administration, in consultation with the incoming Reagan administration, pulled a lot of strings to indicate that the Soviet Union, that any sort of intervention would have the most drastic consequences. But while that was going on, John Paul II sent a letter to Leonid Brezhnev saying that were these Warsaw Pact forces to invade Poland to crush the Solidarity movement, he would be required in conscience to describe that as the moral equivalent of the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. The first and only public presentation of that letter was in Witness to Hope, the first volume of my JP2 biography. 5 months later, the Pope was shot in St. Peter's Square. That's not an accidental sequence of events. I would not say that his intervention was the only difference. It may not have even been the key difference, but it made a difference. And it was the appropriate way for him to deploy the specific kind of soft power, to use that term of art, that he had, which was the power of explaining to the world the moral significance of something happening.
Sir.
Yes, Mr. Weigel, how do you think this Pope, champion of human freedom, would respond to, or what would his perspective be on the rapid rise of ISIS in this past year or two?
Yeah, well, that's, John Paul II bent over backwards for many, many years to try to strengthen those forces within Islam that were trying to find an Islamic path to something other than what you see in its most grotesque form in ISIS. And I think one has to say it didn't work very well. And he understood, I think, the reasons for that. If you read what I think is the most personally revealing of his books, the long interview book called Crossing the Threshold of Hope was published in 1994. He talks at some length about Islam. He talks about his profound respect for Islamic piety, for Islamic commitments to charitable activity, says that a lot of Western Europe could learn something from the Muslim commitment to prayer, but then goes on to say that, as he understood it at least, and he's speaking as Karol Wojtyła, who happens to be John Paul II, not in some authoritative magisterial way as the Pope, but he says we have to understand that Islam's theology and anthropology are very different than ours. And a real dialogue has to begin with that fact. It can't paper that fact over. I think the more insightful, even more insightful, papal commentary on all of that was the now notorious, but I think prophetic, Regensburg lecture of Benedict XVI in the fall of, when was that, 2006 or 2007? I can't remember. You remember this? The Pope, I'll tell you how I learned about this. My wife and I are having dinner in Krakow on a September evening with John Paul II's first altar boy, who is now one of the world's most distinguished high-energy particle physicists, who is in the midst of helping design the superconductor at CERN in Geneva. And his wife another Wojtyła kid from back then, who was then the vice rector of the Krakow Academy of Music. So anyway, we're in the midst of this very pleasant dinner, and my mobile goes off. And it's an Italian reporter calling from Rome, saying, "The Pope has made this crazy speech about the Muslims. What do you have to say about it?" And I said, "I'm not in the habit of commenting on papal speeches before I've read them, and I haven't read it. See, but what do you say about it?" I said, "Fax me send me the text, and I'll read it on the plane tomorrow, and you can call me tomorrow evening." So I read it, and the guy called me. And as I have said since, if you have never conducted a transatlantic interview from the Wendy's in Newark Liberty Airport, you really haven't lived. But anyway, when I read that speech, it seemed to me Benedict got it exactly right. The two issues, to go back to the Huntington proposal, the two issues between Islam and the rest, in terms of the things that this institute cares about, do not have to do with theology, in sense of unitary God, Trinitarian God, and so forth and so forth. They have to do with two questions. The questions that Benedict tried to put on the agenda at Regensburg and were totally ignored by the world press. The first, can Islam find within its own resources, within its own sacred text, its own legal tradition, etc., Islamic warrants for at least religious toleration, if not religious freedom in the full orb sense of the word, including Islamic warrants for people changing their religious position, if you will. And the second question, clearly related to the first, can Islam find within itself, again, within its own materials, its tradition, its scripture, its legal tradition, Islamic warrants for distinguishing religious authority and political authority in a 21st century state? Maybe not full-blown separation in the American sense, but at least distinction. Those are the two key questions. We can worry about the Trinity versus Allah 300 years from now. Right now, those are the two questions that create what Sam Huntington called the bloody borders between Islam and the rest. And I think those are the questions that we ought to be focused on right now. And it may be that the sheer barbarism of ISIS, which is very bad for Muslims. I mean, it's obviously very bad for Coptic Christians in Egypt, too, and in Syria and Iraq. But it's primarily bad for Muslims, might help compel that kind of thought. But those are the two issues, it seems to me. And to deny that those are the two issues, to try to push all this under the rug with some mantras with which we're all familiar, is just silly. I mean, it's worse than silly, it's dangerous. And I would hope that that conversation can begin here. I mean, the reason why Jewish-Christian dialogue has gone much farther in the United States than any place else in the world is because the Jewish community is secure in the United States and therefore can enter into a serious exchange with Christians. The same thing should be true for the Muslim community in the United States. It's secure enough here that it can engage those questions, or it should be. But that involves, among other things, protecting American Muslims from the fanatics who are being sent here and elsewhere from the Middle East.
Let me pose another question to you. The Islam that is practiced, or historically has been practiced in much of sub-Saharan Africa until recently, is Sufist Islam. I was in Nigeria when I was the aid administrator, I think it was 10 years ago, and a Sufist imam came up to me at an event, and he said, "Mr. Natsios, we are your best allies." I said, "Who's we?" He said, "The Sufist community. Most Nigerians are not these other people." And this is 10 years ago. This is before any of this happened. Yes. He said, we tried, why don't you have conversations with us? The Sufist tradition is actually a mystical form of Islam that's very, there are exceptions. In Central Asia, Sufism took a different form. I'm not suggesting it's universal. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it actually was very tolerant. In Ethiopia, which is 30 or 40% Muslim, it's almost all Sufist Muslims. And it's a little authoritarian to do this, but whenever these more Wahhabist or more extreme elements would come in from other countries to Ethiopia to convert people, the government would throw them out and say, look, we established a working relationship between the Orthodox Christians, the Ethiopian church, and the Sufist Muslim imams 1,000 years ago. We help them build their mosques, they help us build our churches, and they get along in the villages. I mean, there's been problems 1,000 years ago, but over the centuries they have worked it out. And I used to meet with religious figures when I would travel, and they told me in Ethiopia, interestingly enough, we don't want these ideologies coming in here because we've already worked this out, and it's fine in the villages. What do you do? I mean, what have we not done in terms of dialogue with the Sufists, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, we don't, if by we,
I mean the Western Christian community. I don't mean the government. No.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Christian interreligious dialogue has a tendency, like everything else in the Western world, to get bureaucratized.
Yes.
So you create offices for interreligious dialogue. They try to find their counterparts. So they go to Al-Azhar in Egypt, or they go to wherever, Qom in Iran, and say, okay, you know, what number do I call? Who's the number do I call? It's like Henry Kissinger. Who do I call to get Europe? This is like, who do I call to get Sunni or Shia? And the Sufis seem to fall through the cracks because there's so much more diverse community.
Yeah.
There's no center of Sufism like Al-Azhar operates for the Sunnis, or some of those academies in Iran for the Shia. From the point of view of this institute and this school, which is slightly different, I have always been struck by my friend Peter Berger, the sociologist of religions, speculation that the form that where Islam will begin to come to grips with these two questions is not in the Middle East or Africa, it's in Asia. It's in Indonesia and Malaysia. Indonesia is now what, the second largest Islamic country in the world. It's had lots of rough patches, as has Malaysia. But there seems to be something emerging there. And it may well be because these attempts by Wahhabism and others to get inroads there have been rather undemocratically, we might say, resisted. There may be something emerging there that 100, 200 years from now will be different. It has made an enormous amount of difference, to state the obvious, that these, particularly the Wahhabi extremism, which would mean nothing except for what Saudi Arabia is sitting on top of. I mean, if that were an oil-free area, I mean, Wahhabism would be not a big deal. It's that resource and the material wealth that has come out of that has created the reach of this around the world. That is not going to last. I mean, if you take the view out 50, 100, 150 years, that isn't going to be the case And so there might be, but it does require, if you will, holding the fort until then. So I think I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for that talk. That was very good. I noticed in your comments about the increasing disorder in the world and maybe the trends in the West, a hint of pessimism.
A hint of,
Pessimism.
ah,
And I wanted to know what other notes of optimism do you see in the world, either in emerging leaders or in emerging movements? You mentioned the Muslim movement in Indonesia and Malaysia, maybe that's one, but what other notes of optimism do you see that might change this trajectory?
the greatest note of optimism I discern in the last 2 weeks, or actually the last 10 days, is that pitchers and catchers have reported.
You and George will.
I give a lecture in Washington every January called the Simon Lecture. And last year I did it on the origins of the First World War for the centenary of World War I, not a particularly pretty picture. The year before I had suggested that we were a country suffering from a lack of reality contact in various ways, and that this explained a lot of our messy politics. So before Christmas this year, my wife said, you're going to say something nice this year? You're going to give us something positive in January? It is difficult. I mean, I think I am with Orwell. The first obligation of intelligent people is to recognize the obvious and to state it. And the obvious is we are in big trouble. I think there are great regenerative powers in American culture and society. I think the fact that the United States has not become as spiritually arid as Western Europe is a great sign of hope for the future. But I think we have been brutally reminded over the past 6 years that order has to be maintained. Order is not self-generating in world affairs, never has been, isn't going to be. And if those forces in the world, which I identify with the West, which stand for order in the name of decency, human rights, the self-expression of the human person politically through democracy, abandon the field, which is essentially what's happened over the last 6 years, then the forces of disorder will take over. That's what's happening on the periphery of Russia right now, certainly what's happening across sub-Saharan Africa right now. It's happening in the Middle East. The West has got to get a grip on itself and understand that unless it reasserts leadership in ordering the world, disorder will order the world. Now, I am waiting for a presidential candidate of either party to say this. Because unless over the next 2 years, the next president, whoever he or she may be, in whatever party he or she may represent, has not prepared the American people for the difficult job of reestablishing a measure of order in world politics, then he or she is going to wake up on the morning of January 22nd, 2017, having seen the previous day on the desk in the Oval Office the full array of the mess that will be the world at that point, and say, why did I ever want this job? I mean, that's the gravity of the situation. We may well be in a position by January 2017 where the fundamental international security architecture that has seen the West through since 1947 has been dismantled. And unless you start thinking now about what you're going to put in place of that, you can't start thinking about that on, after the inaugural parade is over. I mean, but that's the level of seriousness. We're going to have to reinvent a world order, to cite the famous phrase of the president for whom this school was named. And that's serious business. Yes, this gentleman here.
This question's a little awkward after that one, but in line of living with in line of not living with the shackles of low expectations, how do we balance that with not living with rose-tinted glasses or living in the world for what it is?
Well, excuse me. I'm at the tail end of a cold, which I'm hoping College Station is going to finally drive out of my system here.
Or reinforce.
Or, no, I don't think so. I can only answer that in terms of myself. I try to maintain some balance between refusing to submit to the tyranny of the possible and being a realist about how grave the situation is through religious faith. I'm in the happy position as a Christian of believing that I know how the human story is eventually going to turn out. That the God's will for the world will be vindicated, and at the end of the story, the Creator will get at the end what the Creator intended at the beginning, which is a redeemed humanity. That gives me a little bit of not insouciance about the present, but a little bit of relaxation about it. I mean, I'm not in charge, God is ultimately in charge, and that pattern has been established long before me. I wrote a book in the wake of the Cold War, a set of essays on various foreign policy themes that was called Idealism Without Illusions. And that's the stance I have always tried to take towards world politics, or to politics in general. I mean, I think politics can be a noble enterprise. And I say that having worked in the Congress and having counseled with the executive branch people. I know the underside of the rug, too. But I think idealism without illusions, keeping open the possibility of change, keeping open a faith in reason, but recognizing that there are irrational and indeed wicked forces that can only be stopped. That's the kind of balance I try to maintain.
Right here, one more question here.
Mr. Weigel, you talked a little bit about the distorted view of tolerance that is so common today, and recent public policy tends to support this idea of subjective truth. Do you think that the United States will be able to overcome this hurdle, and if not, who will lead the world in the struggle for morality?
Well, I think we've got a better chance here of recovering a sense of, if you will, the objectivity of truth, including moral truth, than Western Europe at the present moment. A friend of mine who used to teach philosophy at the University of Dallas, Professor Janet Smith, used to say, if you really believe that Americans don't believe in moral absolutes, light a cigar in the no smoking section of a restaurant. Or park your car without the handicap tags in the handicap parking spot at the Giant. And you will discover very quickly that Americans believe in moral absolutes. The problem she was suggesting was that we've forgotten how to account for the moral truths we believe in. And we've been so bludgeoned by a culture that identifies tolerance with indifference rather than what I described, the engaging of differences within a bond of respect and civility, that we tend to get beaten down. So I think there's material to work with here. But I do also think that unless the United States recovers a sense of what was inscribed in our national DNA at the beginning, self-evident truths, then we're in big trouble. Because you cannot run a civilized society of 330 million people on the basis of, I'll do my thing, you do your thing, Rodney King, why can't we all just get along? If we don't have a reasoned reason for why we should be civil and tolerant, then you get this dictatorship of relativism problem. And that's a big one right now.
I think we're well over the time for this evening's conversation. George, thank you very much. It's
Thank
been
you
a
for
pleasure
having me.
having you. Good.
Good.
Thank you all for coming.